Hello and welcome to the third lecture in my series on the consequences of drug use, a series that is really devoted to the question of, is drug use a problem? Now, in future lectures I'll be talking about specific drugs and talking about problems associated with their use and also about benefits associated with their use, at least for many of the drugs that I'll cover. But for the time being, again, I'm just trying to address some of the risks and the problems associated with drug use, and maybe even more precisely address the ways in which people think about those risks. How do we measure or understand the types of problems that can occur when people use different types of drugs? Now, in the previous lectures in this series, I addressed toxicity. That was the first lecture where I talked about different ways that we can measure the damage that some drugs do to either physical or mental health. In the most recent lecture in this series prior to this one, I talked about dependence or addiction, how we can try to understand the risks that some drugs will pose, at least for some people, in terms of inspiring persistent addictive use. And in this lecture, I'm going to focus on some of the social problems associated with drug use. Now, this lecture, I guess like its predecessors, could be expanded to be very, very long. It's not. It's actually a relatively short lecture for me, and I'm really only going to focus on a few social problems which are sometimes associated with drug use, crime, and especially violent crime, or even more generally, just aggressive behavior. There's a lot more that can be said about this topic and a lot more that we'll try and put into future lectures, but for the time being I just want to focus in a fairly narrow way to just these one or two problems. So again, just by way of a preview, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the problems that are associated with drug use, particularly problems of violence and criminality. So, does drug use lead to violence? A simple question, but like so many of the simple questions at the beginning of these lectures, one that if you poke at it a little bit will lead hopefully to more substantive and more nuanced questions. Is drug use associated with violent crime? Similarly, a kind of a question which seems simple at first, but which can lead to deeper and deeper and probably more and more interesting questions. I should say that it's clearly the case that in popular media, especially movies, there are associations that are made between drug use and violence and violent crime. This image here, as I'm sure almost everyone watching the video is aware, is a famous scene from the movie Scarface, starring Al Pacino, of course, who plays a drug dealer, or sort of a man who rises from obscurity to become the head of a drug empire, and then is taken down in a very violent way at the very end. I'll link to a couple video clips from this movie which I found on YouTube, which were probably uploaded illegally, so they may be pulled down by the time you get to them, but if you have a chance to watch them, they're very interesting. The movie itself I think is very good, although of course it's very violent, and there are also some other quite disturbing parts of the film. So if we think about popular media, of course there's the idea that drugs, at least some drugs, and violence go together, but of course this is a science class. We want to focus a little bit more on this question from a scientific perspective. And with that in mind, I would argue that there are two ways that we can measure problems of this sort. There are two ways that we can measure the association between drugs and problems such as violence and criminality. One One is by using non-experimental approaches. These are typically studies that are conducted in the field, which is to say out in the real world, where we look at the extent to which there's a correlation between the use of particular drugs and interactions with authorities that regulate violence and criminality. So to what extent do we see a correlation between the use of a particular drug and being arrested by the police or being incarcerated into the prison system for various crimes, especially violent crimes? Another approach we could take to measuring the relationship or the association between drugs and violence is by conducting experimental studies. These are typically studies which occur in a laboratory with people who are recruited from the community or from university settings, in which we can manipulate the presence or absence of at least some drugs, and we can measure whether or not people who receive drugs or are using drugs are behaving more violently or in more criminal-like ways than those who are not. Now, these two broad approaches, experimental, non-experimental, can be applied to almost any field of study, certainly almost any field of study within psychology, and it's not that one is particularly good and the other is particularly bad. As I think I've mentioned in previous lectures, in an ideal world, these two broad approaches to research can be mutually informing of one another. But for today's lecture, I just want to focus briefly on these two approaches and hopefully give you a sense of what we can learn when we pursue research in these areas. Okay, so if we begin with non-experimental research on the relationship between drug use and criminal behavior, especially violent criminal behavior, one of the most notable efforts has been the Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring Network, or ADAM, which was run for a time out of the U.S. Department of Justice and consisted of a network of participating law enforcement areas in different metropolitan cities, which would cooperate by gathering data from drug urinalysis or from interviews on the types of drugs that people had in their system or reported using when they were arrested for various crimes. It's not the ideal way probably to measure or to look at the correlation between drug use and criminality, especially violent criminality, but it's at least a decent effort at getting a sense of how much we tend to find drugs among people who are being arrested for various reasons. And there's a lot of data that is published out of ADAM. I'm going to link to the National Institutes of Justice coverage of the ADAM data on the Blackboard website, so you can take a look for yourself. But depending on where you're reading, you see that upwards of 60 or 80% of people who are arrested for various crimes test positive for at least one drug. Now, some folks have argued that this may tend to overestimate the relationship between drugs and criminality, in so much as a lot of the people arrested are arrested for drugs. You know, they're arrested for drug crimes, and so they tend to show up positive for drugs, either having used them themselves or having reported some association with drugs. So that 60 to 80% may be kind of an overestimate, at least according to some, but it gives us a sense that in a fairly large fraction, perhaps even a large majority of arrestees, there is evidence of drug use. Now, the Bureau of Justice Statistics is an organization that keeps track of data on arrests and data from prison populations, etc. Basically, almost any area of the U.S. justice system has numbers, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics, as you would guess from their name, tries to gather these numbers and take a look at them. They report, and I'll link to their website as well, they report that alcohol is common among arrestees, especially for violent crimes. So we see maybe 30 to 40% of people arrested for violent crimes have some involvement with alcohol. They were using alcohol at the time of the crime, they were intoxicated, etc. Again, I will link to this the website so you can take a look at some of this information yourself. And clearly we could investigate the relationship between various drug use and various types of crime, but for the purpose of this lecture, I do want to focus principally on violence and violent crime, just because, for obvious reasons, I hope, those are things which really concern us a lot. Here is some data from a survey of inmates in state and federal correction facilities that I found on the on the Bureau of Justice Statistics website, and you can see, if you look here, total numbers and percentages of people arrested for different types of crimes who had reported using alcohol. So you can see again that sort of 40%-ish people who are involved in violent crimes are positive for alcohol, at least when we look at state prison systems, where most people who are arrested for things tend to end up. Somewhat lower numbers in federal prison systems, but similarly correlations apparently demonstrated there. So the important idea here is that drugs are clearly associated with crime, especially violent crime. Although, as we saw when we looked in previous data from the Dawn network, looking at not arrests but rather hospital admissions related to different drugs, it's a little bit difficult to know the exact relationship between drugs, including alcohol, and in this case violence, because we know the number of people who engage in violent behavior, at least who are arrested for violent behavior and who are using alcohol. But what we really want to know is what fraction is that number out of the total number of people who are using alcohol. And clearly alcohol is a fairly broadly used or commonly used drug. So even though 30 or 40% of people who are arrested for violent crime are reporting using alcohol, as a fraction of the overall population of alcohol using people, that still may be relatively small. Nonetheless, this idea that alcohol and other drugs, but maybe especially alcohol, go together with violence certainly has some support to it, and I think is fairly broadly accepted. So alcohol use is correlated with crime. Let's just allow that, though we could perhaps debate about the exact size of that correlation. But an interesting question that we could ask is, if drug use or alcohol use is correlated with crime, does it in fact play a causal role in crime? Does using drugs, does using alcohol lead you to behave in a way that is more likely to get you into violence, more likely to get you into violent crime? Non-experimental studies, generally speaking, aren't good at answering causal questions. Most non-experimental work simply looks at correlations between variables, and correlations, of course, are very interesting and can tell us a lot, and without any correlation there's no possibility of two variables being causally related to one another. But if we want to kind of drill down on that question, two variables are correlated, but is one the cause and is one the effect? That's where we typically need to go over to the world of experimental research and do some experimental studies. So measuring violence in the laboratory. Experimental studies allow us to test causal relationships, and if you've taken a good introductory psychology class or a good biology class, or indeed a good any science class, you're probably familiar with some of the language of experimental research. In experimental research, we typically identify at least two variables. One is called the independent variable, or sometimes the predictor variable. The other is called the dependent variable, or sometimes the outcome variable. And the independent variable is the presumed cause, the dependent variable is the presumed effect. And the way experimental studies typically work is a researcher will in some way manipulate the independent variable and look to see if a predicted change occurs within the dependent variable. So a researcher might bring a group of people into his or her laboratory and might assign some people to take a particular drug or to consume alcohol at a particular dose, and assign another group of people to not take the drug or not take the alcohol, thus creating a situation in which there's a manipulated difference between using a drug or not using a drug, and then might look to see if those two groups behave differently from one another on some measure of violence, on some measure of some other dependent or outcome variable. Now, if those two groups differ, then it's reasonable to assume, allowing for certain potential complications, but it's reasonable to assume that it's that change in the independent variable which in some way led to that change or difference in the outcome variable. That's the basic idea of experimental research, or at least most experimental research. And again, if you've taken a good introductory any science class, you should be a little bit familiar with that. I'll try and provide some more information online if you're not, or if you're less comfortable with how that works. Assuming that you are fairly comfortable with experimental studies, do a little bit of practice work right now. Pause the video, take a moment or two to think about this. Try to, in your mind, design an experimental study that could test the theory that drug use causes violent behavior. So if you wanted to study this relationship between drug use in general, or maybe pick a drug that you're particularly interested in, and violent behavior, how would you construct, or how would you design and implement an experiment that could allow you to evaluate the causal relationship between that independent variable, drug use, and that dependent variable, violence? Okay, so probably what you were thinking is something a little bit like this. You might do an experimental study, and well, I'll admit right away, experimental studies are hard to do for illegal drugs and for violence, for reasons I'll get to in just a second. But you might imagine having a group of participants come to your laboratory, either all together or one at a time, and randomly assigning those participants to one of two possible groups. One group might be given a drug, one group would not be given the drug. That would be the independent variable, drug use. Drug use yes or drug use no. And because our participants were randomly assigned to be in one group or the other, there should be, on most variables, no real differences between our drug using group and our non-drug using group, except that the former is using a drug and the latter is not. So those groups, the people in those groups on average, are only really different from the others, in the other group, as a function of their assignment to use the drug or not use the drug. And then at some point after use or non-use for the non-drug using people, you might imagine measuring violent behavior in some way and then looking to see if there's any difference between the two groups. Now, I already said experimental studies of this sort are really hard to do with illegal drugs and with violence for two probably pretty obvious reasons. One, not most, but many of the drugs that we're interested in are illegal, so it's very difficult to do any sort of research with them. Folks who do research on illegal drugs typically have to get very strict supervision and very elaborate permission from law enforcement authorities to even have the drug. When you have an illegal drug, of course, it's ethically incredibly complicated and problematic to give drugs to people. Let's say you were studying the relationship between cocaine and violence. Assuming you could even legally get cocaine, it would be very ethically problematic to give cocaine to people versus not giving it to people. Have a group of undergraduates come into your office and say, all right, you guys use cocaine. Hopefully that would set off a lot of alarm bells in your university, and they would probably object to you doing that type of research. But let's assume you could get the drug. Let's assume you could safely and ethically administer the drug. You would still be faced with the problem of trying to measure violence. How exactly do you measure in a laboratory violent behavior? It's tricky to do. There is some research in this area using illegal drugs. What is somewhat more common, or an area where there is more research, is looking at alcohol use and violence. Now, of course, we're interested in alcohol use and violence because we have at least some reason to believe that alcohol use is associated with violence based on our non-experimental research. We can kind of quibble about the magnitude of the correlation, the strength of the relationship between alcohol use and violence, but I think few people would argue that there's at least some relationship between using alcohol and being engaging in violent behavior. We don't know exactly the causal nature, so we do experimental research. It's relatively easier to do this research than to do research with illicit drugs because, of course, alcohol is a licit or legal drug, at least for people who are over age. And so it's not as difficult to purchase alcohol. Of course, it's not as difficult to assign people to groups who either get alcohol or who do not. For what it's worth, in my graduate training for both my master's thesis and my dissertation, and actually a couple other studies, we did this type of work where we would recruit undergraduates who are 21 years old or older, and we'd assign some of them to consume alcohol in our laboratory at a precise dose, and others would consume a non-alcoholic drink. It's tricky to do that, but it can be done. Of course, you're still left with that challenge of how to measure violent behavior in the laboratory. Again, this is tricky even for alcohol research. It's not like you can just give everyone weapons and say, all right, go ahead and behave violently. That would be unethical, it would be impractical, it would be immoral, I suppose. So think for a second, how might you measure violence in the laboratory? Probably what you would think of, if you haven't already done so, is developing some sort of a laboratory analog or a simulation of violent behavior, a way of measuring violence or aggressiveness that would be relatively safe and practical to do in the lab. Now, there are different ways to do this. And different labs over the last, oh gosh, it's been almost for 4 decades now, have come up with different ways of measuring aggressiveness or violent behavior. In modern times, a lot of this research takes advantage of computers and video game technology. So you might have participants come into a laboratory and play in a competitive computer game, one person against another, or even our participants against a fictional opponent. You tell each participant that he or she is playing against an opponent in another room. In reality, there is no person in that other room, but from your participant's perspective, they think they're competing against someone else, and in the course of their game, they can maybe behave violently if it's a violent video game, or they might even be given the opportunity to administer some sort of a noxious stimulus to their opponent, their real opponent or their fictional opponent. So some of these types of laboratory analog tasks for measuring violence or aggression will use electrical shock. You could imagine I'm a participant in one of these experiments. I'm playing against a real person, or I've been told I'm playing against a real person, and every time I want to shock him, I can, and every time he wants to shock me, he can, or the computer can simulate him shocking me. And the extent to which I shock my opponent gives you some indication of how aggressive I'm feeling. It's not quite the same thing as me punching that person or shooting them with a gun or stabbing them, but presumably if I'm willing to shock some person with electricity because I think it'll help me beat them in our video game, then I'm in a kind of an aggressive state of mind. So a lot of research in at least with alcohol and aggression has done this type of thing. Bringing people into the laboratory, assigning them to either receive alcohol or not receive alcohol, and then allowing them to compete in competitive aggressive analog type games. And there's actually a lot of research in this area. When I give the lectures on alcohol, I'll talk a little bit more explicitly and about some of the different studies that have been done. But suffice it to say, research in this area has been going on for quite a few decades now. And in general, there's evidence to suggest that alcohol use is associated with increasingly aggressive behavior, at least on these type of laboratory analog tasks. So here is a summary from a study that I will link to on Blackboard, and what you can see here is data that compares participants in these types of tasks who are either sober or who are at a very low level of intoxication. They're given just a whiff of alcohol to hopefully trick them into thinking that they're drinking. This a so-called placebo dose of alcohol. If I was if I wanted to trick people into thinking they were drinking alcohol but not really give them enough to have an active drug effect on them, I might dose a very small amount of alcohol on the top of a beverage and say, here is an alcoholic drink, please consume it. Then there are people who are at lower doses, moderate doses, and higher doses of alcohol, up to about sort of 0.75 grams per kilogram is, for our purposes, just below legal limit. 1.0 is just above legal limit. And on the y-axis here, you can see aggression measured with z-scores. Z-scores, for those of you who've taken some stats classes, are maybe familiar, but for those of you who haven't, basically 0 on a z-scored scale corresponds to an average level of whatever it is you're measuring. Positive values correspond to above average values, negative to below average, and you can kind of see this nice fairly rectilinear relationship here where people who are sober or who are only very slightly drunk actually are somewhat less aggressive than people who are than the average, but people who are more intoxicated, especially as they get to sort of frankly fairly drunk levels of intoxication at or above the legal limit, tend to behave more aggressively than the average. Now again, an important point to make here is that this is on laboratory analog tasks. Aggressiveness in computer games, aggressiveness in administering painful but not particularly dangerous or harmful shocks or similar noxious stimuli to real or fictitious opponents. I guess the takeaway I would offer is that there is reason to believe that some drugs, especially alcohol, and we should say we've studied alcohol a lot more than we've studied other drugs can increase aggressive behavior. From the non-experimental research, we see some evidence that actual real-world violent behavior is correlated with alcohol use. Although we may not be exactly sure of how strongly correlated they are, there seems to be a connection there. From the experimental work, which is not using real-world violence but rather simulated violence, we see some evidence that as people get more drugs in their system, or especially more alcohol in their system, they behave more aggressively. Now here's a chance for you to practice. Practice thinking about the research I've just outlined, and ask yourself, am I persuaded by this? Why or why not? Does it seem reasonable to me to conclude, or does it seem reasonable to you to conclude that there is a causal relationship between drugs and violent behavior, especially maybe alcohol and violent behavior? No research is perfect, and the research I've presented is not perfect either. It's conceivable that you're not persuaded that there's a strong enough case made for this causal relationship. It may also be it may also be that you feel persuaded. I think it's important to kind of practice your critical thinking skills in general, just in life, and especially when we're talking about science, and maybe even especially when we're talking about social sciences like psychology, and in this case the psychology of drug and alcohol use. Now ask yourself, is alcohol directly associated with aggression? What evidence do we have for that? Or is it possible that both are associated with some sort of other third variable? Recall that in previous lectures I talked about this idea that there can be an apparent causal relationship between two variables, which is really the result of a so-called third variable. So it may be the case that personality variables, such as in this case sensation seeking, lead people to be more likely to use alcohol and lead people also to be more likely to be aggressive. It may be the case that someone who's kind of a thrill seeker by nature might enjoy using alcohol or drugs and might also enjoy being kind of aggressive, such that the apparent relationship between alcohol and aggression is mostly or maybe even entirely due to this third variable. Scientists try to control for these third variables. That is, they try to rule them out so as to better make an argument about the direct and unambiguous relationship between a putative independent variable and a putative dependent variable. In the case of non-experimental research, a lot of this controlling is done using fairly clever statistical and mathematical techniques. In experimental research, we try to control for these variables typically by using design elements. So I might recruit a large sample of people for my study of alcohol and aggression, and I might randomly assign an equal number of people to the alcohol group and the no alcohol group in the hopes that if there are third variables like differences in personality, differences in sort of aggressiveness, that those differences on average would be the same, or those values would be on average the same for both of my groups. I wouldn't accidentally end up with all the really aggressive people in the alcohol test group and all the non-aggressive people in the non-alcohol test group, or accidentally end up with all the men in the alcohol test group or all the women in the non-alcohol test group. Experimental designs like this, if they're done properly, can sometimes minimize the effect of third variables like personality, gender, age, other things which could obscure this relationship. But again, no research is perfect, and there is still some open question, I think, as to the exact relationships between drugs, and maybe especially alcohol, and socially problematic behaviors like aggression. So just to back up and do a quick review, remember that at the beginning of this three-part lecture series I asked the kind of open question, is drug use a problem? How do we know? How do we make judgments of risk or dangerousness? And I said, well, there are broadly speaking three ways: toxicity, addiction or dependence, and social problems. Now we've spent some time thinking about these different ways of judging risk, and I hope you're better able to evaluate the riskiness of drug use, both in your own personal life, which I suppose is very important, but also in your kind of public life, as you talk to your friends and family, as you vote for politicians, as you read the news and think about how society in general should treat various sorts of drugs. An important idea here, I think, is that judging risk is complicated, like pretty much everything else about drugs. Probably many things in the social sciences and psychology are tricky and complicated. Probably drug use and the relationship between drug use and various risks is just one of those things. It's complicated, and as I've said before, we should resist the urge to be overly simplistic or especially judgmental in our simplicity about this. Another interesting idea, I think, is that risk is only loosely correlated with illegality. It's tempting to think that the illegal drugs are the dangerous drugs, however we measure risk, and the legal drugs are the non-dangerous drugs, however we measure risk. But the reality is that there are some drugs which are relatively low risk and are illegal. So for instance, marijuana is a drug which is not particularly toxic by almost any way that it's measured. It's not a drug that's particularly addictive, although people can become dependent on marijuana. And it's not a drug that's particularly associated with social problems outside of the fact that it is illegal. If marijuana was legal, it's not a drug that we have a lot of evidence would inspire people to behave in criminal or violent ways. Yet, this relatively low-risk drug is illegal. Other drugs are legal but high risk. So alcohol is quite toxic. You can easily kill yourself with alcohol. You just need to drink too much of it and your body will die. It's a drug which you can become addicted to. There's certainly ample evidence that people can become physically and psychologically dependent on alcohol, and it's a drug which I think there's fairly good evidence is associated with some important social consequences which are negative, like increased aggressiveness, and yet this is a legal drug. And it's just one of those interesting cases. I think the benefit of taking a class like this, or at least the benefit of thinking about the material I'm presenting in this class, is that hopefully it makes you a little bit more careful about your judgments as to what constitutes riskiness and what constitutes non-riskiness, and maybe better informed if you're faced with decisions that impact how you use drugs and how you guide in your voting and your public behavior society's use of drugs. Finally, I should finish by saying no drug is risk-free. All drugs carry some risk. So even though I've just said that marijuana is a relatively low-risk drug, I think it is, at least as compared to alcohol, it's not a no-risk drug. There are essentially none of the drugs that we're going to look at, maybe with the exception of caffeine, is a no-risk drug. All drugs carry some risks, at least for some users. Okay, well, thank you for sticking with this. This has been a relatively short lecture, I know. That's probably a good thing. As a preview, next time I'll be starting the lecture series on drugs in the body, drugs in the brain. I'll begin first by looking at the peripheral nervous system, then I'll be moving on eventually to talk about the central nervous system, about some basic biochemistry, and also some pharmacology. That pharmacology actually will kind of call back a little bit to some of the material that I covered when I talked about toxicity. So hopefully it will build up and it will seem kind of familiar and interesting to you. So lots of really interesting stuff coming up. I look forward to talking about it. I hope you look forward to listening to it. But as I always say, take a break, step back from the laptop, put down the tablet, maybe look outside, think your thoughts, try and engage your mind a little bit. And as I always say, thank you for your attention. I always appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.